Choose face or wheel depending on whatever's happening. Okay, so turning. It's really nice and therapeutic. Certainly after you've done wheel, it's just like relaxation. After you've done stress. Yeah. So it is lovely. I mean, it just feels so nice carving at the clay. And it's a lot simpler. All you've really got to be able to do is just stay still, and you've pretty much mastered that if you've been doing work on the wheel anyway. So the first thing you want to do with this is just have a really good look and a really good feel of your bowl. Generally speaking, what you want to try and do is to have the same thickness throughout the whole piece. If some bits are thicker or thinner than others, then it can exert a bit of stress on the clay and cause cracks and things. So if you've got the same thickness all over it, it should be really good tempered when it dries and fires. So have a really good feel of it. Take a good look at the curves and the shape on the inside, because that's what you kind of want to reflect on the outside. And try and feel the different thicknesses and see where you do and don't want to cut. So this is very even thickness right down till about that point, so I don't really want to cut past there. And the bottom, try and get a bit of an idea. You can't always bring your fingers together, so you've got to guess a little bit. There's about a centimetre of clay down the bottom there. So obviously one of the things that can go a bit wrong is if you cut all the way through by accident. So that's one of the first things you want to look at: how much clay have I got I can remove. And once you've got it on the wheel and you've got it centred, if you had to take it off to have a look, it would be really difficult to get it back in exactly the same place. So much better to have a really good look and gauge what you want to do before you start, so that you don't have to move it. So take a really good look, have a think about what you want to do, then you want to get it on the wheel and get it centred. So look down directly from above so that you can use the rings that are on the wheel to try and put it roughly in the middle. And then if you get a little bit of speed on the wheel, just enough to see whether it's in the middle or not, you can see if you need to adjust it or if it's got to go back in a touch. So the first bit to look at is usually the rim, because if your foot is offset from the ring, it looks really weird. So use that as a bit of a guide. If it's not very round, then you might need to choose a different part of your pot. Usually I tell people before they take something off the wheel to trim with the turning tool, give it a nice chunky bottom. So if the rim doesn't quite work, then usually this bit is probably the best part to go. So if you hold your finger up just next to it, you can see whether it's running continuously or if it comes away from your finger. So you can just stop, take a look at the rings, adjust it, see if you think it's about right. But it does take a long time to learn how to get things centred by eye. It's really tricky. So a really useful little tip when you're trying to learn to figure out where you need to shove it is to hold a needle up to it, just nice and close, and just let it stroke over where it touches, and then stop the wheel, take a look at it, find a scratch that you made and find either end, and then in the centre of that scratch, that's the direction that you need to push it to get it in the middle. So you can try that a few times, do it in different places, until eventually you've got this just running continuously on your finger. So that's obviously a lot easier if your bowl's completely round. If it isn't, you have to compromise a little bit. Once you've got it in the middle, then you can get it stuck down. So I'm going to give it a tripod, 3 little sausages. You don't want to move it off now you've got it centred, so keep your hand flat on it, and then just tuck that down to make sure it's nice and stuck. So it's a real pleasure to turn a pot, but if it's not centred, it becomes a real pain. So it's worth doing this bit properly, making sure it's right in the middle and in the best place before you start. Alright, squish that down. Great. So there's a couple of things you need to do before you start. The first is to get this completely round and completely level. Once you've done that, you can relax and just enjoy the process. So if there's anything that's already really messy before you start, maybe you forgot to trim this and it's really chunky, or this is really messy, it's not a bad idea to just give it a little bit of a smooth, because it's easier to do that than try and do all the turning tools. You can use the grater to take off any really manky bits, and then you can get yourself started. So if you've not really done turning before, quite a good thing to do just to practice before you start is to practice drawing rings with a needle. Once you've got the habit of how to hold the tool and how to hold still, then the rest of it's quite simple. So unlike the wheel where you do everything right down here, when you're turning, the cutting angle, you've usually got to get up a little bit, so you've got to find a way of holding yourself so you can stay nice and still. I tend to I'm right-handed, so I put my left elbow down and then hold my right hand with my left hand, and then I can be really nice and stable, elbows tucked in, and I can do whatever angle I want without wobbling around too much. So the first thing you want to do is find your position and just have a little practice. Once you can reliably draw circles with the needle rather than wobbly bits, then you're sort of comfortable with your position and you know what you can do. So just run out those little lines. So when you're trying to get this nice and round rather than wobbly, it's easy to get a little bit mesmerised by the wobble going round and round and round. So it's quite a good idea just to give yourself a mark to aim for to start with. So I'll start with a little circle with the needle, and then you can make sure that you're getting it right. And you can either get the circle cut nicely by cutting from the outside and going inwards, or cutting from the inside and going outwards. That's just a matter of preference. So I'll show you both ways. When you're using the tool, you don't want it to be able to flex, so you don't want to hold it like a paintbrush or anything like that. Best way to hold it is flat to your wrist like that, and then your wrist can't flex at all. And especially with your other hand wrapped around it, you can stay really still doing that. So with these tools, you're either using the flat edge and cutting the tops of ridges or curves, in which case you're working at about 3 o'clock, or you're using a deeper part of the tool and cutting in deeper grooves, in which case you work at about 4 o'clock. So it's either there or it's there, depending on what you're doing. So I'm going to use the flat to cut off the top ridge and try and get it nice and round. The trick is to stay extremely still and just let it skim off the tops of the lumps, and then gradually bring it in until it's nice and round. The other way you can do it is, instead of using the flat part, use the deep part of the tool, cut yourself a nice groove so that your hand is really steady, and then bring it out. Once you're really nice and still and comfortable, then keep that stillness going and bring it out and try and cut off all the lumps. So whichever you prefer, it's just a matter of preference, so you can try both of them. So once you've got that nice and round and perfect, then your life gets much easier. You can just kind of enjoy it. So most of the time, the bottom should just be flat anyway, but sometimes you will have problems when the bottom isn't quite flat. If you just rest your fingers on, it should just run around smoothly. If it's kicking your fingers up and down, then you've got a bit of a problem, because that's a pain with the tools. So the way to deal with that is, first of all, to check the rim. Maybe that needs levelling off, in which case you can grate it and grind it before you get ready to do this. Sometimes it might be a bit wonky because maybe it was cut a bit wonky with a wire, in which case you need to level off the bottom. That's quite tricky to do. It's very, very hard to hold still enough with a tool to stop it from kicking you up and down. So the best way to do it is to shred the clay so it chops it up into really tiny chunks, because it's much easier to stay still and chop off a tiny chunk than it is to try and stay still and cut off a really broad area. So any time that you've got unevenness or you've got a pattern that won't go away, like, have you seen chattering patterns? If you're holding the tool and you don't hold it still enough, it starts to vibrate.
Oh yes, I know.
So it puts really weird, wonky, wavy patterns in, which can look quite cool if you want to. But any kind of wobble like that, every time you put the tool over it, it reinforces it. It just makes it bigger. So you've got to try and get rid of the pattern in order to cut it off. So with that sort of thing, if you had chattering you wanted to get rid of, you just scrabble up the pattern, scratch it up so it can't just go back into the same place again. And then you should find it much easier to cut off with a tool. Same sort of thing with the top here. If it's not even, if you sit and shred it, so try and drop this to the same height rather than dropping up and down. With a tiny little needle like this, it's easier to stop it from going up and down. So if you just drop that to the right height and just keep shredding up the clay like that, and then you use the tool to chop that off with, you should find you can do it pretty easily without that moving. So hopefully that's something you won't encounter, because it's a pain in the bum. If it's a big wobble, you can start by grating it and then just do the rest of it with a tool. But that's why it's always worth taking care of your pots when you take them off the wheel. So making sure you turn the wheel when you cut it, so you cut it really nicely, making sure you use a turning tool to give yourself a really nice clean chunk, cut around the bottom and all that, and then it just makes it much easier to de-wobble it when you get to this stage. So let's just get into this little knot. Alright, so when everything's round and beautiful, I'll just take those scratches off the outside. Then you can just really enjoy the actual sculpting part. So you can just give it a really neat, smooth finish, or you can cut a foot ring. Foot ring is the thing that's really useful to do when you're turning. It's much harder to do by hand. So you want the clay to be the right texture. If it's a bit too hard or a bit too wet, then turning gets really difficult. So if you've not really got much thickness of clay on the bottom, that's a really nice texture. If you've not got much thickness on the bottom and it's already a bit dry, then to be perfectly honest with you, it's much better just to finish it by hand. Just give it a quick trim. If your tool starts squeaking, that tells you the clay's too dry. It's either just take it off and finish by hand, or take time to damp it down a little bit before you get it back on the wheel. But when it's just the right texture, it's a real joy. It just feels really nice to work with. So I'll show you just really simple finishing on the wheel, and then I'll show you how to do the foot ring. So especially the first time you do it, it's not bad to give yourself like reference lines. So if you think about it, okay, what shape do I want from this now? If I just want a nice curve, I'd probably just continue that curve all the way through, in which case it would get to about there. So you can either just visualise that, or you can give yourself a mark to work to. As well as cutting too deep, one thing which can go a little bit wrong on this is if you accidentally gouge the tool, in which case, as well as taking a chunk out of it, you'll probably just flip the whole thing off and have it bouncing off a wall. So the way to avoid that is just not to try and take off big chunks of clay at once, just take off slim ribbons. So you can either do that with a flat edge here by rocking it backwards and forwards across the ridge, which is also a very nice way of making sure you keep a nice curve. The other way you can do it is just to chop a big chunk of clay up into smaller chunks. So you can use the ridge to chop grooves into your pot, and then chop the tops off the grooves. So either way, you just want to be taking off fairly skinny amounts of clay, and then you're not going to have problems if you gouge it by accident. So for this one, I'm going to use this as my guideline and just rock backwards and forwards until I get rid of the clay I don't want. Now, it's not uncommon that you've got a really beautiful, perfect circle up here, but the rest of the pot is just very slightly wonky, in which case you start developing a really obvious line between the two. That's actually quite easy to get rid of. When you do this point and you're rocking backwards and forwards with the tool, at this point you actually loosen your hand up so that it can move with both the circle and the wobbly bit. It'll start blending the two together. So you can just rock that backwards and forwards across the line. And it will make sure that really obvious area has disappeared and it actually just blends nice and smoothly into the other one. So when you're doing the bottom, if you want to get rid of a layer of clay, the trick is just to do a spiral, it's close set. So if you want the pot to sit nicely without wobbling, rather than trying to get it flat, it's actually better if it's just slightly dipped on the inside. So if you start from the outside and then push a little bit harder and you get to the middle, that'll do that for you. So I'm going to use the broad groove here, about 4 o'clock, and just bring that spiral all the way in. A little bit harder in the middle. The tricky bit is a bit right in the centre, because if you cross over the centre by accident, it's going to gouge and go the other way. So quite often I'll just go up to it and leave that little pimple in the middle and get rid of that by itself when I'm staying extra still. So bring that in, go a little bit deeper in the middle, and make it above that bit by itself. Now if you look a little bit closer, you can see that the grit in this clay does mean you get a few drag marks. So if you want to smooth things out a wee bit, take out the sort of slight spiral marks you get from the tools. Using this like a blade is quite good for that. I'll just take out the tooling marks. You may or may not want the tooling marks. Oh yeah, definitely. It's just a matter of whatever you prefer. This will always cut slightly better if you give it a little curve, a little flex. And if you want to get rid of the gritty marks, then just give it a nice little polish with a kidney, and then it'll get it really nice and smooth. Sometimes with the clay, especially if it's a touch on the dry side, it looks very uneven because you get dark and light patches where the compression is slightly different, but that doesn't necessarily mean the texture is uneven. So as well as actually looking at the texture, it's always a good idea to feel it, just to make sure that your eyes aren't deceiving you and there is actually texture there that you need to get rid of. So that's just really simple to finish. If you want to get a foot ring in, then you need to start digging out some more clay from the inside and the outside. So I'll start at the moment just by making a line to show you where I want the foot ring. So if it's a fairly broad ring, then your pieces look like sort of quite rustic and chunky. If it's got quite a narrow little ring in the bottom, then it tends to make it look more elegant. So you can kind of choose what you're after. I'll make this one a little bit smaller. So that's where the outside will be, and then choose what thickness your foot ring is going to be. There we go. So that's what I want to be excavating. So you always do the outside first, because if you did the inside and you went cut slightly too far on the outside, obviously you've got problems. So you either cut from the side inwards or the top downwards, or a bit of a combination of both, just to get rid of those. So this is where it can be quite nice to think about what shape and type of tool you're using, because obviously when you're cutting down there, that's gonna decide what profile, what shape you've got. So you're gonna get different shapes in your pots depending on what kind of tool. So there are a whole bunch of other little tools. That I left them on the side there actually, and also some slightly different types. Yeah, bring both the box and the pot over, and I'll just show you quickly. So this is more of the same kind of tool, it's just you've got a bunch of different profiles here, so you can get different curves, different shapes on the inside and the outside. These ones, they're a slightly different type of tool, and but these ones you're using them at 3 o'clock. Use them that way. So part of it's just preference as to what kind of tool you prefer, and sometimes it can be more useful, like if you're trying to get to a very tight area down here, that kind of tool might be slightly easier. So you can try different shapes and different styles and see what you prefer. The big one that we use for throwing, that's not very good for dry turning. That's much better for wet turning. We're just trying to scrape the clay out of the way.
Although that does look a bit like...
Yep, it's just a much smaller profile, so there's less friction. Because if you think about it, with that broad area, that's when you're more likely to get vibrations and things happening. So, all right. So I'm going to choose the nice curvy end, start cutting down. Get rid of a little bit of clay here. Chop this off. And now, of course, is when you want an idea of how deep to go. So I know I've got about a centimetre of clay there, so I can happily go down about half a centimetre. And then I can just get rid of this, rock it backwards and forwards to blend it into the rest of the curve like before. And again, round about here it starts getting thin, so I don't want to do a lot of cutting down here, I just want to curve this part off. And I'll let my hand just relax a little bit too, to make sure things move in nicely together. And I quite like that little round line there, but you could get rid of that and do different shapes, different parts of your tool, depending on what you wanted. So that's the outside looking good. Now we'll do the inside. I'm going to use the deep part of the tool here so I can excavate a whole layer of clay. So I'm going to start by making a nice groove here which will hold me still, and then go right towards the middle. There we go. So you can make a nice deep set of grooves, then you can chop the tops off the grooves. And then you can carry on doing that until you've got the depth that you want. Now at this stage you might start getting a little bit nervous about wondering whether you're going to cut too far. So take away most of the clay that you're happy with, and then as you get a little bit closer to where it might get thinner, just take off smaller amounts of clay. Just take off little bits, and then if you feel it's starting to flex slightly, that's the warning point. It's like, okay, that's where you stop. So take away most of the clay, and then if you do the rest of it quite gently, so I'll just get this nice little shape in here. So now I'll start cutting off smaller amounts. I'll also make sure it's quite neat as well, so that I can stop whenever I want to. The bottom of this is actually slightly soft, so it will start dropping fairly soon. This is the one occasion in the studio where I'm not going to glare at you if you... this isn't dry, it's not going to create dust, but it does collect in the middle and it's a pain in the bum. So nice little shape there. And I'm going to start using other parts of the tool now just to make sure it's nice and smooth and I'm getting the shape and the texture that I want. More often than not, if you try and take these bits off with your finger, they actually end up getting stuck to the clay. So cool. So that's a nice looking little shape. Last thing which I usually do with this is, again, rather than having this flat where it's a little more prone to wobbling, if you rest the flat edge of the tool and then just rock it from side to side to give it a little curved profile, that usually means it sits without wobbling on most surfaces. And then just about smoothing and finishing everything off. So you can keep the marks of the tools, slightly bulgier than I meant. You can deliberately add spirals and add shapes that you like the look of. You can get in and use this tool if you want to get things really smooth. And then when you want to polish things, same sort of thing again, you can get in with a kidney. But if you've got more sort of intricate shapes like this, you'll also find just using the fingers is really good for a polish. And that's a bit more useful. You've got the spiral like that, it'll smooth it down, but without getting rid of the spiral shape. There we go. Nice. So if you want, one of the nice things about having a foot ring is it means you can get glaze in the bottom too. You can only do that if it's at least 5 or 6 millimetres thick. If it's shallower than that, you still won't be able to put the glaze on. It's a little bit too risky. And I always tell people if they're going to do that, make sure they write the name and the details on the ring, because otherwise it'll get covered up by the glaze. So now we can take that off, have a good look now it's finished. And if I've done the job about right, it should be pretty consistent thickness all the way through.
Wow.
Which that is. If you've got something that you're going to get rid of and it's just something you're practicing on, it's not a bad idea to slice it through with a knife just to assess what you've done, see how it actually looks compared to how it actually feels. So you can have a little feel of that if you like. Now one little thing which I will also show you is how to trim right down to the edge of the bowl. Most of the time that's what you want to avoid, partly because it's usually quite thin anyway, and also when you get further down and the sausages are in the way, then of course you've got to get further down, and yeah, it's a bit of a mess. But you can get right to the edge to trim it if you need to.
I was wondering that.
Yeah.
I wondered if that was bad practice or something.
No, usually you don't need to, and you try and keep away from it so you don't accidentally put in more marks that you then have to get rid of.
Yeah.
If you can just wheel that bucket a little closer,
This?
so yeah, just so I can get a little water. So if you want to do that, run your fingers around, a little bit of water. You don't want it to be able to slide off, so not much, just a little film all the way around. There we are. And then pop this down on top. It's got to be level for it to stick, so you might have to level it off, it's a bit wonky. Look down from above, try and find the right sort of place, and then give it a tap. And that's just enough suction to make sure that it stays stuck. With this, it doesn't even matter if it's not perfectly in the centre because you're very gentle with it. You can move with it a little bit. It won't hold for very long, so when you're doing this, you've got to keep your hand just resting there to catch it when it goes. It will go.
When it dries
and then, yeah, you won't ping off the wheel and go off everywhere. You can't use the normal tools because you'll have to press too hard. The only one which is really worth using for cutting is this one. You can't take off much clay with this, so if you want to be delicate with something, if you're afraid of cutting too far, this is a really good tool. It's also really good for this one because you can get it right down, tucked in there, get right down to the edge if you need to. So much slower now. When you're doing normal turning, you go very fast. If you go slow, you feel every lump and bump, and you've got to feel so still to get. If it goes fast, it just skips all the little bumps past. It's much easier to keep still. With this, I wouldn't go more than about half speed, just to stop the seal from breaking too early. And then, like, this isn't very well centred, but like I say, you're so gentle, you can just let the tool move with it. You can tuck it right down here, get rid of any unwanted lines or textures or anything like that. And you can also still get in and polish it with this too. So it might break, the seal might break, and you've got to stick it back down again. Otherwise, when you're done, you can just give it a little tug, and it'll come itself. It'll come free. Just make sure the top isn't too gooey. So that's really useful if you go a little bit too far by accident, if there's something you want to repair. You can technically turn the inside, but it's a complete pain. It's not quite so easy to secure, and of course you've got all the little bits collecting on the inside. So generally when you throw, you try and make sure the inside is as perfect as possible, because it's much easier to deal with wobbly bits on the outside and just cut them off and get rid of them all, change the thickness, whatever you need to do. So we've pretty much mostly done short things like bowls and plates so far. They're really easy to get on the wheel and secure, and they'll stay put quite happily. Once you start doing taller things or oddly shaped things, it gets a bit trickier, and there's other ways of attaching things to the wheel. But to start with, just putting it down with a couple of sausages is all that you need. Cool. So first thing to do is have a really good look and feel of your pot. Then maybe have a little practice with the tools, how to hold it, how to hold yourself until you're comfy. And then it's all about getting that outside circle perfect. Figuring out how to hold yourself so you can get it completely circular. And then after that, you can just kind of relax and enjoy sculpting. You do spend quite a lot of time with your head upside down for a little while, just so you can see the shape. Some people quite like to work with a mirror in front of them. But yeah, just always do the outside first and then you do the bottom.
Okay.
Cool.
Cool.
Yep, all good. I'm going to give it a go. Thank you.